Okay, friends, welcome to this lecture series on debates in Indian politics. Today's reading is The State by Partha Chatterjee. This is an essay, some 10 pages essay written by Partha Chatterjee, a famous social theorist and political scientist, who had contributed enormously to the study of state politics and post-colonial state in India. Friends, study of state is one of the underlying themes in political science classrooms. In essence, people define study of political science is the study of state. Studying state has always been a central theme in the literatures on political science. If you look at the British state, you can see there are enormous literatures on how British state evolved over the 500 years of history, how the American state evolved over the 300 years of its history, or how the French state evolved after French Revolution of 1789, or how the Italian state evolved after Mussolini, or how the German state evolved after Nazism, or how the Afro-Asian nations evolved after their experiments with colonialism. So friends, studying state is a central pillar of political science literature. So there are enormous literatures on the study of Indian state, and one such study is provided by Partha Chatterjee. But Partha Chatterjee is not the only one scholar who contributed enormously to the study of Indian state. There are Sudipta Kaviraj, Adul Koghli, Rudolf and Rudolf, so many writers. But your syllabus prescribes you study Partha Chatterjee's writings on Indian state. And friends, Partha Chatterjee has divided this essay into almost 4 parts. First part, he divides this essay into state and politics, the first 2 decades, 1947-67. Then he talks about state in India in 70s and 80s. Then he talks about state, the nature of state in post-1980 era. And he finally talks about the current phase of Indian state in the post-reform era, or after 1991, or in post-liberal India, the nature of Indian state, or the nature of connection between state and society. These are, the different phases of this essay. And friends, his essay begins with a fundamental question. What is that question? Let us see what is that question. Partha Chatterjee asked a very interesting, a beautifully crafted question. He asked this question like this: how much of the structure of Indian state after we became independent are inherited from our colonial times? We know that we were a part of the British Empire. We were colonized by the British Empire, and our institutions, political institutions, our legal structure, our political structures are shaped by Britain, not by Indians. And the question he raised, a very interesting question, a curious question. What is that question? He asked us to interrogate, friends, how much of the state that we are having today is inherited from our colonial past? How much of the British legacies are still remaining in the Indian state, in its institutions, in its legal structure, in its engagement with the citizen? And he is trying to answer that question. He is trying to answer that question in this essay, The State by Partha Chatterjee. And let us see how he is trying to answer that question. What was the question? How much of the Indian state that we have today is inherited from the colonial past, our experiments with the British colonialism, or our connection with our British past? And he was saying that it is true to say India was partitioned. Of course, when India was partitioned in 1947, India was bifurcated into Pakistan and India. And significantly, there was a reconfiguration. That means a change. There was a big change in the territorial boundaries of India, which was drawn during the period of British rule. In post-independent India, when India was partitioned, otherwise when India was partitioned, there was of course a big change in the political boundaries of India. That being stated, Chatterjee is telling you that more significantly, India inaugurated a constitution in 1950. We became a constitutional republic. We got a head of the state, a head of the government, prime minister, president. We got a parliament. We represent that represent the spirit of we the people. And radically new features were added to the structure of Indian state. Radically new features were added to the very structure of Indian state, which we had inherited from the colonial British past. First, unlike the British past, the most important thing is that a sovereign legislature emerged, which is represent the will of the people, not the will of the crown, British crown. Before partition of India, the legislature represented the will of the crown. Now, the legislature represents the will of the people in India. And our constitution preamble says, we the people of India. That means ultimate authority, ultimate power rest with the people of India. And members of our sovereign legislature is elected by a process of universal adult suffrage. And there is no communal reservation or representation which was being practiced by our British past or our British government. So there is no communal representation, but there is a reservation for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. But there was communal representation during our British past. Another thing is that all the citizens in India got fundamental rights. This is our land. India became independent. we got a constitution, we are a republic, and friends, you all got certain fundamental rights which are being protected by constitution. No government can take away that rights. Constitution provided a parliamentary form of government and a British type of executive which is responsible to the parliament. Our executive is responsible to the parliament, and parliament is elected from the people. And we have an indirectly elected president who is the head of the state. And we also have an independent judiciary. And the constitution provides for a federal feature, a federal constitution, a federal state. And there is distribution of powers between the union government and the state governments. But Chatterjee admit the fact that, friends, you see, having stated all these radical new reconfiguration of state structure in India, which are comparatively so much different from our British state during the pre-partition era, basic apparatus of the administration of state, the basic apparatus of the administration of the Indian state in independent India was inherited from our colonial past. Chatterjee admits there is not much changes in the administration of state structure. There is not much changes in the governmental administration which we have inherited from the colonial past. There is not big changes in the way we administer government in India. And you see, administration in India is consisted of a small elite cadre, belonging to the All India Service, which was during the British rule said to be the steel frame. During those days, during the colonial days, we call Indian Civil Service, ICS, Indian Civil Service. And this was said to be the steel frame of the British Raj, And that steel frame was retained even after India became independent. And now its new name is Indian Administrative Service, IAS. And IAS, or Indian Administrative Service, was modeled on the ICS, Indian Civil Service of the British Raj. And the basic structure of civil and criminal law is still the colonial. Chatterjee admits the basic structure of civil and criminal law administration in India is inherited from the colonial past. Only one major difference is that we have, of course, a Supreme Court, which you cannot see during the in Britain. There is no Supreme Court in Britain that we have in India. And the Indian Armed Forces is still so much colonial. its structure, its rank and file are still colonial. It is based on the British Army. The tradition of professional army is strictly still colonial. Having stated this, Chatterjee admits, though we have some radical reconfiguration of the Indian state, there are so many things which we are still maintaining, which are inherited from the colonial British period. There is not much difference. Of course, there are changes in the institutional structure. There are changes in the institutional structure. And this is an introduction being provided by Partha Chatterjee in his essay. Now he proceeds to explain the different phases of Indian state which was evolved after India became independent. And he is trying to tell us the 2 decades, what happened to the Indian state in the 2 decades following 1947. So he is subtitled that section as State and Politics 1947-67. 1947-67. So Chatterjee presented a brilliant analysis of India's state during this phase. A very brilliant analysis. Let us see what is that analysis. Friends, Chatterjee characterizes the 47-67 period of Indian state as the congress system. Majority of you might have come across that terminology, the congress system. And you know that that terminology was not used by Partha Chatterjee. That terminology was deployed by the famous Indian political scientist Rajni Kothari in his book Politics in India. And Chatterjee endorses that idea. What is that? 47-1967 period of Indian state or Indian politics. Indian state and Indian politics can be characterized as the congress system. What is the congress system? You know it. Congress party ran government at the center as well as in the state. Congress party ruled in all the states, provincial states, and Congress party ruled at the center. And the Congress party or provincial party, the Congress provincial party enjoyed considerable autonomy in relation to the central party structure. And this was, according to Chatterjee, 1947-67 period of Indian state, according to Chatterjee, was the era of a developmental state with emphasis. It was an era of developmental state. That means Indian state was the source of all the progress in India, all the developmental initiatives in India. State was considered to be a harbinger of change. State was considered to be an allocator of resources. Thereby, people in India can have a better life. There is no role for market. Today, market is flourishing in India. And if you don't get job in the government sector, of course, we will move on to the market and find a living there. We will find an earning there. Because market is so powerful today. But those days, 47-67, everything was the state. State possessed all the resources and it allocated to the needy people. That's why Chatterjee calls this era the developmental state era. And through planning, the state intervened in the economy. State promoted the life of the citizens through welfare activities. State promoted, state improved the lives of the population through welfare activities. So considerable state intervention in the economy means, those days, the state intervened in the economy means there was progressive taxation. Those of you have higher earning, you will be taxed more. There are state public services, such as education. Education was a public service. Education was considered to be a public commodity. Today there are private schools, private university, private education. Those days there was no such thing. No private education, no private universities, no private schooling. All the education system was controlled by the state. So education was a public service. Health. There is no room for private health services. No private hospitals. All the hospitals belongs to the state. So health was a public service. Transport. Friends, there is no room for private transport. Transport system was monopolized by the Indian state. So you can say it's a Nehruvian state, an era of Nehruvian state. That means the Nehruvian state, 1947-67, was in a sense an era of Nehruvian state. So the famous Nehruvian state, when somebody said it was an era of Nehruvian state, that means Nehru consciously adopted a Soviet model of socialist economy. But at the same time, a market economy coexisted. But that was not powerful. That was not a counter to the power of resources of the state. But of course, there existed a private economy. That's why this Nehruvian state era is otherwise called the era of mixed economy. You might remember. You might have studied in degree classes or during your school days. It was a time of, mixed economy. And 47-67, what happened in India, friends? You just interrogate. What happened to the Indian state? There were so many problems. The problem by the middle of 1960s, what happened? The Nehruvian model failed. India faced the worst food shortage. And when India faced food shortage in the middle of the 1960s, government started importing large quantities of food grains. This created severe foreign exchange crisis in the middle of the 1960s. Then another problem. there was huge increase in defense expenditure. A very major portion of our GDP went for defense expenditure. But at the same time, GDP allocation for social sectors, welfare sectors. You know that India was a welfare state those days. There were no room for private economy. Despite the fact that some private capital existed, all the resources were possessed by the Indian state. But the point is that when GDP allocations were organized, you will see that resources were flowing into the defense side, but at the same time, social welfare policies receive comparatively lesser. So by 1967, Chatterjee is saying there was a sharp fall in Congress votes. There was a sharp fall in Congress votes. By what time? By 1967. Up till 1967, there were no problem in the Congress system because a Congress government was at the center and Congress governments were at the provincial state level. And there is no conflict between the central government and the state government because the same party ruled at the center as well as in the provincial states. But in 1967, friends, the Nehruvian model began to be challenged because it became incapable of meeting the needs of so many people, because India is a very vast country, friends. India is a very vast country, and there are so many things which are all gathered in the hands of Indian state. It's a vast population, a vast land mass, so many priorities, and friends, all these priorities seem to be, in a sense, Indian state seem to be unable to meet the demands of various sections. That's why there were dissatisfaction at the various corners across the length and breadth of India. And in 1967, you will see that there was a sharp fall in the vote banks of Indian National Congress. And you will see 9 states for the first time in the election 1967, you will see 9 Indian states, provincial states, for the first time had non-Congress government. Non-Congress government. See, the Congress system failed. The Nehruvian model of economy failed. And friends, Chatterjee admits the fact that the 1967 general election, so 1952, 1957, right? So the 1967 general election, what happened? There were no problem in the 1952 election or 1957 election. But except the 1967 election, you will see for the first time Indian politics began to change. There was compelling tendencies in the Indian political scenario. Not only because the Congress has lost its overwhelming position in the Indian politics, not only because the Congress had lost its overwhelming position in the Indian politics, but also because, friends, for the first time, you will see 9 non-Congress governments were formed in the Indian states. Therefore, for the first time, there were strains in the Indian federal system. Because in the Nehru era, provincial states had Congress government. So there is no major dispute between provincial states and the central government. But now, 1967, what happened, friends? You got 9 non-Congress governments. They began to make claims which the central governments are not in a position to satisfy. So, strains in the Indian federal structure for the first time took place. And Chatterjee is going to analyze its dynamics. What is the dynamics of, the Nehru state in the 47-67 period? And you will see this dynamics has been beautifully narrated by several writers. What happened to the Indian state in the 47-67 period? Some very good literature has been, provided by some brilliant minds, some brilliant political science academics. One interesting writing was provided by Norman D. Palmer, who had written a very interesting book, The Indian Political System. It was published in the year 1962. Then, friends, Morris Jones had written about this situation. Morris Jones, Morris Jones. Morris Jones had written about this situation. In 1964, Morris Jones had written, and the title of his book was The Government and Politics of India. The Government and Politics of India. That was, written by Morris Jones. And these writers believed. What are the writers? Who are the writers? Norman D. Palmer, Morris Jones, and Chatterjee quotes these writers. And it was believed that these writers believed that a liberal democratic constitutional system in which people exercise votes and political parties form governments, and political parties is going to satisfy the demands of the people, and all these will take place in a system called a parliamentary system, and parliament will pass laws and regulations to meet the aspirations of the people. This is called a parliament liberal democratic constitutional system. And it happens through a universal suffrage system, because people who are at 18 will get the opportunity to exercise votes, universal adult suffrage. And it is believed that Indian political system would gradually develop into a process of democratic decision making system in which people take decisions for themselves, and you will have a rational administration and modern citizenship. All these things are there. And it is believed that from a modernist perspective, if you have a democratic constitution and you have a democratic system and you have a universal adult suffrage system and people have voting rights and people will govern themselves in such a system, it is believed that people better their situations. It is believed. That is what happens all over the world. That has happened in Britain. That has happened in France. That happened in many European states. That happened in USA. When you give people the right to vote through a process of democratically elected government, you have a rational bureaucratic system, you have a rational administrative system, things will improve. But friends, the studies of Palmer and Morris Jones provided an insight into this theory that Norman D. Palmer and Morris Jones were saying that Features such as patronage relations, that is, caste-based, caste and political leadership, the relationship between caste system and political system, or the relationship between religion and political system, and ethnic solidarities, different ethnic solidarities coexisted with the modern institutions. That is, caste coexisted with the modern institutions. Religion coexisted with the modern institutions. Regional or other ethnic solidarities, language, food culture, your costume culture, all these ethnic identities, friends, that began to coexist with the modern institution. Of course, India state was a modern state. It had a rational bureaucracy, it had a rational laws, it had a constitution, it had parliaments, independent judiciary. These are all modern. But what was the problem? The problem was that these institutions were implemented in a society that wasn't modernized. And Rudolf and Rudolf argued that in their book, The Modernity of Tradition, in their book, 1967 book, The Modernity of Tradition, which Partha Chatterjee has quoted, in their book, 1967 book, The Modernity of Tradition, written by Rudolf and Rudolf, which is quoted by Partha Chatterjee, and also another book, a 1970 book, 1970 book by Rajani Kothari. Book title is Caste in Indian Politics. Caste in Indian Politics. These two books are, friends, benchmarks books to study Indian politics. Rudolf and Rudolf, The Modernity of Tradition, Rajani Kothari, Caste and Indian Politics. In these two books, friends, these writers identified one important trend in Indian politics, that everybody thought when you have modern institutions, when you have modern parliament, when you have universal adult suffrage, a democratic system, people govern themselves through a constitutionally granted administrative democratic election processes, everything will be okay, things will be better, and India will prosper, people will have good life. But friends, what happened in India? These writers argue that these Morris Jones, Palmer, and Norman D. Palmer, and Rajani Kothari, Rudolf and Rudolf, these writers argued. What they argued? They argued elements of tradition, such as caste, religion, infiltrated into the modern systems of political institutions. Friends, it was a big problem as far as the Indian state was concerned. Elements of tradition infiltrated. What are the elements of tradition in India? Caste is an element of tradition. Religion or ethnic solidarities, these are elements of tradition which unfortunately infiltrated into the modern institutions. And it transformed the very nature of our modern institutions. It transformed the very nature of our modern institution. And in a sense, it spoiled the spirit of our modern institutions. And we remember, Nehru was such a very great modern man. He had a poor respect for rural societies. Why? Because he believed, like Ambedkar, that India has all the backward thinking. India had all negative thinking in its rural mind. The caste is highly rural. Religion is highly rural. Ethnic solidarities is highly rural. That's why he tried to industrialize India through a planned economy from second 5-year planning onwards. In the first 5-year plans, motivated by Gandhi's words, he introduced development projects in the agrarian sector. That's why first 5-year plan had given more emphasis to development initiatives in the agriculture sector. He thought that if the agriculture sector is improved, India will improve. But he realized that, like Ambedkar said, India's rural economy is a den of ignorance. All the problems India faces comes from the rural economy, because there is ignorance, there is the problem of illiteracy, there is the problem of superstition, ethnicity, caste loyalties, ethnic solidarities, religious superstitions. All these exist in the rural sector. So India needs to be industrialized. India needs to be modernized through a process of industrialization. But what happened? These writers says Partha Chatterjee realized that India's very modern institutions are infiltrated by elements of tradition. So a brilliant analysis about this has been given by India's foremost political scientist, Rajni Kothari, in his thought-provoking book, a 1970 book. One book I have already told you about was Caste and Indian Politics, and a brilliant, that was said to be a classic about India's politics. That book was said to be a classic about India's politics, which I have already told you in my previous lecture on Rudolph and Rudolph. The book was Politics in India, written in the year 1970, published in the year 1970. And this book, Rajni Kothari presented a structural functional framework analysis about India's politics. He looked at the Congress party. Congress party is, of course, dominated by men of high morale. It is dominated by men of high dignity, modern outlook, European education. Its central command is very modern. The Congress Party's central command is very modern. It had powerful men of great insight. And that insight, of course, steered the Congress Party. That insight, that great visionaries, of course, dominated the process of policies, the visions of Congress Party, of course. And he described that insight as a dynamic core. A dynamic core that dominated the Congress Party. That dynamic core dominated the Congress Party. And from village or town to district or to provincial level to the national level, the party was well connected. The party was well connected by that vision, that central core, that dynamic core, which was dominated by modern men of great insight. And they were connected to the township level or to the village level, to the district level, to the provincial level of the party structure. But friends, Kothari identified that there was a very serious problem within the Congress system. What was that? The elites, that is the dynamic core at the central command in the 50s and 60s, in the decades of 50s and 60s, that dynamic core, that elite, that brilliantly educated, foreign educated, modern, with a modern outlook, people with a modern outlook, great insight, liberal values, those people who tried to transform the society, they tried to transform the society. But friends, there was also a serious problem. What was it? At the provincial level, at the local level, there was electoral system. Election is taking place at the ground level. At the ground level, people goes to polling booth. And what are the concerns of the people? What are the concerns of the people? People are really motivated by what they are getting by electing a particular leader. They are motivated by that question only. And this compulsions of the electoral system defeated the great insight from the dynamic core at the central level. That's why, even though the central party structure had great command over the entire party, when it comes to the local level, at the implementation level, at the ground reality, to the field, to the streets, to the bumpy streets, to the township, that command, that central dynamic core, that was spoiled, that was watered down by the compulsions of the electoral system. That's why the Congress system began to fail by the far end of 1960s, 60s. That's why I told you 9 states had lost its Congress governments. Congress lost 9 states in the 1967 general election. So friends, Kothari argues that Congress system was dominated by a consensus model from the party's central command to the local level. A consensus model. But this consensus model was, in a sense, ineffective to meet the compulsions of the electoral politics. When it comes to a question of, religion, when it comes to a question of caste, that modern outlook was defeated. That's why, friends, when Jawaharlal Nehru advised G.B. Pant to overthrow the idol of Indian god Rama from the disputed structure at Ayodhya, G.B. Pant did not do that because he knew the pulse of the population. He knew the pulse of the population because that is a matter of faith. And he had a sensitivity to that question, which Nehru had in. That's what Nehru said. Nehru was an atheist. He had any respect for God kind of things. That why he simply said, throw that idol of Rama into the Sarayu. Throw that idol of Rama into Sarayu. It has no value because that is just a stone. That is just a stone. But what G.B. Pant said, G.B. Pant was the Prime Minister of Uttar Pradesh, those days. And G.B. Pant did not do that. That's why he closed the temple from, worshippers entering into the sanctum sanctorum of the, temple. He closed the door of the disputed structure, and it remained closed for many decades. But why he didn't do that? He didn't resolve that issue because he was very aware. G.B. Pant was very aware. He was a man in the street. He was very close to the people. He was very close to the realities at the street. So the central command had a very great vision. But when it comes to the field, to the streets, to the bumpy streets, realities are different. That's why Kothari like writers, Morris Jones like writers, Rudolph and Rudolph like writers argued that, friends, when you look at the Indian politics in the 60s and 70s, sorry, 2 decades, 50s and 60s, you will see that modern institutions in India was infiltrated by elements of tradition like caste, religion, and ethnic solidarities. So the project of Indian state failed. The Nehruvian state failed. The Nehruvian modern outlook failed, which was defeated by the pushes and pulls of a traditional society. So that's why the Nehru era ended by 1967. Nehru era in Indian politics ended by, 1967 general election. And you will see 1970, the new decade. A new decade emerged in Indian politics. And Rajani Kothari is going to present a brilliant analysis of what is going to happen in Indian politics in the 1970s. In the 1970s. And Partha Chatterjee is saying that in 1969, the Congress party was split. Indira Gandhi's Congress went into general election in 1971. 1971 general election. Indira Gandhi went into the 1971 general election. And through a populist strategy, through a populist campaign, and a famous slogan, Garibi Hatao, that is, remove the poverty. That slogan attracted the masses because their concern was, poverty. Their concern was their empty belly. The ordinary masses in India, their important concern, their primary concern was their empty belly. And what happened? This sloganeering really attracted voters. That's why, friends, Indira Gandhi became a phenomenal figure in Indian political scenario. She became a phenomenal figure, a powerful metaphor of Indian politics in the 1970s. Her party emerged victorious with a huge majority in the Indian parliament. In the general election. And along with the victory of Indira Gandhi in the general election, the structure of Congress party itself changed. And the nature of the Congress party differed from the Rajani Kothari version of Congress system. The Rajani Kothari theory about Congress system, you remember, as I told you, a central party command, provincial party command, and there is no dispute between central party command and the provincial party command because the same party ruled at the central, at the provincial state level. And the provincial levels and the central level was connected by a dynamic core of elite leaders who had a modern outlook and brilliant perspectives about India. But such a system entered, that is called Congress system, that entered, and a new party structure emerged that was installed by Indira Gandhi's charismatic personality. That is what Partha Chatterjee says. Indira Gandhi's charismatic personality introduced a new party structure. And what is that new party structure? First, Chatterjee says, central command is very important. Party central command is very important. The performance of parties and leaders came to be judged by what they have done to their respective constituencies. So the performance of political leaders began to be evaluated through their performance in their constituencies. Another thing is that in the 1970s, Chatterjee identified that in the 1970s, public sector undertakings continued to grow rapidly. Public sector undertakings continued to grow rapidly. And urban middle class and a large section of the working class became dependent on public sector undertakings for their livelihood, for their future. And Indira Gandhi started Green Revolution, which you might have studied in your school syllabus. Indira Gandhi started Green Revolution. And you will see the Congress party got a new phase during Indira era in the 1970s. And it adopted new political strategies. It became a strongly centralized party structure. It became a centralized party structure. During Nehru era, it was not that centralized because it was a consensus model. Congress system was a consensus model. The local leaders had influence on the central command. But now everything changed during the Indira phase. Party became, somewhat centralized. The central command got powerful, influence over the local command. And Nehru era of Indian Congress ended. But what happened is that in the 1974 and 75, throughout the country, several agitations broke out. Repeated use of special laws, such as MISA, Maintenance of Internal Security Act, deployment of central security forces, and finally it culminated into what may be called the state of emergency, 1975-77. And the end of emergency marked a stunning defeat of Congress party all over the North India. All over the North India, the Congress party faced a stunning defeat in general election, and the Janata experiment started. Janata experiment. However, Janata experiment 1978 was short-lived. Morarji Desai, remember, Morarji Desai government came to power 1978. But the Morarji Desai led, what will be called the Janata experiment was short-lived, and India again went into Congress government in the 1980. So this is the second phase of India's state according to Partha Chatterjee. Friends, we will continue this discussion the next day. Are you okay? Friends?
Okay, sir.
എന്തെങ്കിലും ചോദിക്കാനുണ്ടോ?